With the slaying of King Aethelfrith in the Battle of the River Idle in 616, there was no one left to meaningfully stand in the way of Edwin. A prince of the royal line of Deiran, one of the two formerly independent kingdoms along with Bernicia, which were joined together in the creation of Northumbria, Edwin had been chased out of his homeland more than a decade earlier, during Aethelfrith's takeover in 604. Despite having married his sister Akka, the two noblemen evidently quickly came to odds with one another, and Edwin was forced into flight. According to Bede, he spent the next 12 years of his life constantly on the move amongst the Anglo-Saxon courts, attempting to persuade the rulers to defy the growing power of Aethelfrith and take up his cause for the northern kingdom, always evading the daggers of his would-be assassins. Though staying for some time at the court of King Cyril of Mercia and even marrying his daughter, Edwin was eventually forced out once more. Meeting with limited success beyond his marriage and survival, he eventually came to the court of King Raedwald of East Anglia, who after some prodding and threats from Aethelfrith to do away with the Deiran thorn or else be targeted himself, eventually agreed to back Edwin for the sake of his honor after being chastised by his wife. Raedwald's quick mobilization allowed him to take the fight to an unready Aethelfrith, bringing us back to the subsequent victorious battle for Edwin, which immediately propelled him to the kingship of Northumbria. However, by allying himself with Raedwald for his claim, Edwin had pulled Northumbria down from its preeminent position amongst the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of the early 7th century, allowing Raedwald's East Anglia to rise to the top. Still, Northumbria was far from a broken power, managing to stay together despite their history of rival royal dynasties. And through his alliance with Raedwald, Edwin had bought the kingdom room to rebuild, preparing for a comeback, seemingly having learned from the tale of Aethelfrith's reign. The confederation of Bernicia and Deiran was secured through the repudiation of the Bernician royal family. Edwin also accounted for the previous mistakes, exiling Aethelfrith's sons to the far northwest Gaelic kingdom of Dalriada, fully removed from the English world, granting Edwin security in his position, leaving him without any possible challenger to replace him as he lorded over his domain for the next 8 years, being careful to stay on good terms with the East Anglian overlord. Edwin also made great progress in expanding his domain. Continuing the expansion inland from the coast started by his predecessors, Edwin conquered the British kingdom of Elmet, adding it directly to his lands. He fought defensively against the kings of the Ulaid in Ireland, with Bamborough itself said to have been placed under siege. He continued his fight westward after this, pushing all the way to the western coast and likely dominating the kingdom of Raedwald in Cumbria. This opened up the Menavian Islands of Man and Anglesey, the latter of which he took around the year 624 from Cadwallon, who afterward began laying the groundwork of a coalition to take down the upstart Northumbrian. Still, by this point Edwin's power grew to be unrivaled in Great Britain, and the death of Raedwald around the same time created a power vacuum for the High Ruler of Great Britain, which Edwin was quick to fill. It is said that he spread his domination across the entire English world, save for Kent. During his period of rising to the top, Edwin attempted to diversify his web of alliances, aiming for the hand of the Kentish Princess Aethelberg in marriage, following the death of his first Mercian wife. Edwin was initially rebuffed in his offer by her brother, King Raedwald, due to fears that his paganism would obstruct her Christian worship, as Kent had received Christianity from the Augustinian mission nearly 2 decades earlier. Edwin assured Raedwald that he would allow Aethelberg full freedom to practice her worship, and according to Bede, even promised to fairly examine the religion for himself. This was seemingly enough to satisfy the Kentish nobles, and Aethelberg was finally sent north to marry Edwin in 625, bringing along with her the newly consecrated Paulinus as her chaplain, who became the first bishop of a revitalized bishopric of York. Unlike Aethelfrith, not making an enemy of God appears to have not been a mistake. We are given a tale by Bede of how on Easter Day a year later, an assassin named Eomer was sent by King Cwichelm of Wessex to slay the Northumbrian king, whose attempts at diplomacy had evidently not gone over well with all of the kings of England. Lilla, a friend and advisor of the king, immediately jumped to his lord's defense, throwing himself between the king and the poisoned dagger reaching for him, without even a shield to protect himself. This noble act reportedly resulted in Lilla being stabbed the whole way through, with Eomer taking a second one of the king's men to his grave before he was finally brought down. Though wounded, Edwin's life was spared, and the same day saw the birth of his firstborn daughter, who was baptized along with several members of the royal household as the first Christian Northumbrians, and Edwin promised to give up idol worship if God granted him victory over the West Saxon menace. This victory was granted, with Edwin subduing his attempted murderers, and he subsequently gave up idol worship on his return, though was cautious about fully converting to the religion without properly understanding it. Thus, he received instruction in the faith by Paulinus, entering into analysis and discussion on the religion with his foremost advisors, as well as plenty of silent contemplation. Ultimately, in Bede's telling of events, the event which pushed Edwin into Christianity had happened several years earlier, on the night when he was to be slain by Raedwald. Reportedly having been warned of his impending doom by one of his friends, Edwin refused to flee, believing that being the first one to break his pact to stay with the king would be dishonorable. Edwin was left alone by himself outside, when an unknown man approached him, stating that he already knew who Edwin was and what was upsetting him, asking if he would follow a man who would save his life, grant him his kingdom on earth, and even a greater salvation than the one his ancestors had known. Edwin responded that he would gladly do so. The figure then placed his right hand on Edwin's head, telling him to remember this sign and the promise he had made, before vanishing into thin air. Immediately after, Edwin was informed that Raedwald had changed his mind. This promise went unanswered in the following years, before arriving back when Edwin was deciding on his religion. Despite receiving a letter from Pope Boniface himself urging him to convert, the king continued in his contemplation, until Paulinus came to him and made the sign on Edwin's face the figure had done so long before, urging him to make good on his promise and convert. The king thus met with his advisors once more, entering into rigorous discussion, before eventually they all agreed to convert to Christianity, with the chief priest Coifi himself destroying the idols and burning down the high temple. Eventually, however, his expansionist foreign policy and divisive religious conversion came at a price, with the scorned King Cadwallon raising a force in alliance with King Penda of Mercia against Edwin around the year 632. The two armies met in battle at a place called Hatfield Chase, with the pagan British alliance managing to overcome the Northumbrian force, and Edwin was slain in the fighting. Cadwallon dismembered Edwin's conquests, once more tearing apart Bernicia and Deiran. The formerly exiled sons of Aethelfrith were brought back to rule under Cadwallon in Bernicia, and a relative of Edwin named Osric was granted Deiran, forcing the remaining members of the former royal family into exile in Kent. Though his sons never ruled over their father's kingdom, Edwin's Northumbria served as a vision for which Aethelfrith's son Oswald, who was joined with Edwin in Christian faith, would fight for against the invading Britons. Edwin's conquests of Elmet, Man, and Anglesey, and his subjugation of the surrounding kingdoms represented an imperium, which Bede viewed as an early golden age for a Christian Northumbria, writing that lawlessness and banditry were heavily reduced throughout Great Britain during his reign as a result of his firm grasp. His daughter Eanfled would eventually be married to Oswald's brother Oswiu, securing a bond between the two dynasties which had previously quarreled amongst each other, but had always stood for a strong and united Northumbria. Though for a brief time after his death much of the kingdom reverted to pagan worship, this was quickly rectified, with Edwin having laid the foundation for Roman Christianity in the north of England through his deep learning and wise contemplation. Thank you to Joel and Tanya Dennis for joining on Patreon.